pen. So for anybody who's watching, the title of my sermon is The Sound of Silence. So we live in a world of constant noise. Even if you live out in the country, it is hard to find silence. We have TV shows, we have the radio, we have CDs, we have iPods and more. And then there are the planes flying overhead. We have the sounds of cars, of chainsaws, of leaf blowers, and so much more. And all of that noise tends to drown out the sound of silence. And silence does have a sound. In those moments that I am able to be truly silent, I hear many things that I've not heard before. Some are familiar, the sound of birds singing. Others perhaps not as familiar, but present. Steps, creaks, maybe the sound of a frog jumping in a pond, or the sound of insects buzzing. But that's not the sound of silence that I'm talking about this morning. The sound of silence I'm looking for is not even in the name of the song that you've all been thinking about since seeing the title of this sermon. It's a song by Simon and Garfunkel. The words go like this: "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping. And the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone. Neath the halo of a street lamp, I turned my collar to the cold and damp. When my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs that voices never share. And no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Fool, said I, you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you. Take my arms that I might reach you. But my words like silent raindrops fell and echoed in the wells of silence. And the people bowed and prayed to the neon god they made. And the sign flashed out its warning in the words that it was forming. And the sign said, the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls, and whispered in the sounds of silence. First line of that: hello, darkness, my old friend. We tend to associate darkness and silence. The darker it is, often the quieter it is. But I also know that many people don't want silence because they don't want to be alone with their thoughts. And while I understand that to a degree, the silence I am speaking of comes from a deeper place, a silence that needs to quiet even the noise in my brain. See, we serve a God who speaks in the silence, who guides in the silence, who gives life and meaning in the silence. I don't know if you're ever interested in knowing where songs come from, but you're about to find out. I looked up the story behind the sound of silence. I got it from a website called The Gear Page. Everyone knows the iconic Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel song, but do you know the amazing story behind the first line of The Sound of Silence? It began when Arthur Art Garfunkel, a Jewish kid from Queens, enrolled in Columbia University. During freshman orientation, Art met a student from Buffalo named Sanford Sandy Greenberg, and they immediately bonded over their shared passion for literature and music. Art and Sandy became roommates and best friends. With the idealism of youth, they promised to be there for each other no matter what. Soon after starting college, Sandy was struck by tragedy. His vision became blurry, and although doctors diagnosed it as temporary conjunctivitis, the problem grew worse. Finally, after seeing a specialist, Sandy received the devastating news that severe glaucoma was destroying his optic nerves. The young man with such a bright future would soon be completely blind. Sandy was devastated and fell into a deep depression. He gave up his dream of becoming a lawyer and moved back to Buffalo, where he worried about being a burden to his financially struggling family. Consumed with shame and fear, Sandy cut off contact with his old friends, refusing to answer letters or return phone calls. And then suddenly, to Sandy's shock, his buddy Art showed up at the front door. He was not going to allow his best friend to give up on life, so he bought a ticket, flew up to Buffalo unannounced. Art convinced Sandy to give college another go and promised that he would be right by his side to make sure he didn't fall, literally or figuratively. Art kept his promise, faithfully escorting Sandy around campus and effectively serving as his eyes. It was important to Art that even though Sandy had been plunged into a world of darkness, he should never feel alone. And in fact, Art started calling himself Darkness to demonstrate his empathy with his friend. He'd say things like, "Darkness is going to read to you now." Art organized his life around helping Sandy. One day, Art was guiding Sandy through crowded Grand Central Station when he suddenly said he had to go and left his friend alone and petrified. Sandy stumbled, bumped into people, and fell, cutting a gash in his shin. After a couple of hellish hours, Sandy finally got on the right subway train. After exiting the station at 116th Street, Sandy bumped into someone who quickly apologized, and Sandy immediately recognized Art's voice. Turned out, his trusty friend had followed him the whole way home, making sure he was safe and giving him the priceless gift of independence. Sandy later said, "That moment was the spark that caused me to live a completely different life, without fear and without doubt. For that, I am tremendously grateful to my friend." Sandy did graduate from Columbia and then earned graduate degrees at Harvard and Oxford. He married his high school sweetheart and became an extremely successful entrepreneur and philanthropist. While at Oxford, Sandy got a call from Art. This time, Art was the one who needed help. See, he'd formed a folk rock duo with his high school pal, Paul Simon, and they desperately needed $400 to record their first album. You can tell how long ago this was. They only needed $400 to record an album. Sandy and his wife, Sue, had $404 in their bank account. But without hesitation, Sandy gave his old friend what he needed. Art and Paul's first album, by the way, was not a success, just so you know. But one of the songs, "The Sound of Silence," became a #1 hit a year later. The opening line echoed the way Sandy always greeted Art. The two Columbia graduates, each of whom has added so much to the world in his own way, are still best friends. Art Garfunkel said that when he became friends with Sandy, my real life emerged. I became a better guy in my own eyes and began to see who I was, somebody who gives to a friend. Sandy describes himself as the luckiest man in the world. Don't we all want someone like Art Garfunkel in our lives? I know I do. And the most miraculous thing is we have that. Jesus is right there with us, even when he thinks he's not, when we think he's not. Like Sandy at Grand Central Station thinking Art had abandoned him, we have Jesus walking with us. We need to quiet the noise inside of us to know his guiding presence. Why do we struggle against silence so much? Or, I don't know, maybe I am the only person who struggles with silence, but I don't think I am. Is it because we're afraid of what we might hear Jesus say to us when we're quiet? I mean, possibly, but if that's the case, please put in the forefront of your mind, your psyche, your id, that Jesus is gracious and loving. And while he wants you to change and be the best self you can be, he is also gentle. When I allow myself to be silent, inner silent, that is when the stress leaves. The shoulders relax and I can listen. I also tend, when I'm really silent, to fall asleep, but again, the darkness of deep and quiet sleep can and should be healing. Now, many of you know that I have the privilege and opportunity of being the Protestant chaplain at Yagoo Scout Reservation. And this summer at Yagoo, I came across a very unique situation. I got a call that there was a young woman in tears who would not speak to anyone. She just sat and cried. I went over to her and asked the scoutmaster what her name was. I crouched in front of her and told her my name and asked if I could do anything for her. And there was no response, except tears. But in that moment, the Lord communicated to me that what she needed was silence. So I sat down on a log near her and I stayed quiet. And if any of you have known me for a long time, you know that's a challenge for me. One of the challenges that I faced in that was that the scoutmaster kept talking and trying to get her to respond. Now, this particular scoutmaster was a member of the staff, so we had a slightly different relationship, so I was able to let him know that I had the situation as under control as it could be in this moment. I urged him to stop trying to get her to respond and to allow the silence to be there. You see, his questions that he was asking her weren't bad questions, but our psalm this morning says, I remained utterly silent, not even saying anything good. See, even the good can be tarnished if it's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Often I find the very best response is to remain silent. Now, we're at Yagoo Scout Reservation. Was it perfectly silent? Of course not. There was plenty of noise coming from scouts walking up the path, the distant sound of people learning to shoot at shotgun and at rifle, the excited yells from people at the waterfront, and so much more. But where we were was a bubble of silence, and we sat. I was able to acquire some Kleenex, thankfully. I let her know I was putting it near her. But please understand that this so far had already taken over an hour of allowing her to be silent and not to answer any questions, an hour of trying to distract other people so they wouldn't ask her more questions. After a few minutes, she finally used some of the Kleenex. And it was after this that the young scoutmaster remembered that this young lady's mom had said that she often responds better to writing. Now, I could have railed and told him that I needed to have that information an hour ago, but I do believe that this young lady needed me to sit in silence with her. So I got out a pen and paper and asked some questions, eventually simplifying the questions more and more till I finally got to the question, do you like freeze pops? That's when she reached her hand out, grabbed the pen, and wrote down the word yes. I went back to my cabin. I gathered a bunch of freeze pops. She managed to polish off 2 of them. And then we communicated via writing some more, slowly getting out that she feels more comfortable in quiet environments, and she communicates far better through writing. So the next step was to communicate to the scoutmaster and the staff, and to her, that she needed to eat her meals outside. There are provisions for that. And her tent mates would need to be told how best to communicate with her. Just so you know, this was on a Monday. The scouts arrive on Sunday. This was Monday morning. And if things had gone differently, it could have been that she needed to go home because the noise was too much for her. Thankfully, her tent mates were fully on board, and by the end of the week, she was smiling and laughing. Now hear this, I never heard her speak, but she stayed the week, and because of that, it was successful. Now, what I will take credit for in the midst of that is listening, for knowing that silence was what was needed. The whole process took almost 3 hours. And honestly, in the past, I'm not sure I could have sat silent for 3 hours, but silence was what was needed. And not only for her, for me, and for the staff. Everyone was much quieter dinner for the morning, and in fact, it seemed like they were smiling more too. I did eventually acquire 100 note cards and a bunch of pens, and I passed them out to the scouts so they could communicate. And that's what they did all week. And that's one example of how silence can change the world for one person. Art Garfunkel did that for his friend Sandy. When Art let Sandy find his way, I am sure the voices in his head were screaming that it couldn't happen. And while it wasn't perfectly smooth, Sandy was able to navigate. And I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that the only way Sandy was able to make it was that he quieted the voices telling him no. With God's unerring guidance, I did it for this young lady. How much more does Jesus do it for us? While I was working on this sermon, I was really struggling what it was that I was going to preach about. I finally had a chance to mow my lawn. I only say that because I have a very old riding mower and it takes time to get it started. But while I got on it, now you realize mowing the lawn isn't a quiet thing. But with that, I'm alone with my thoughts, right? So the mower does the work. I have headphones on to just cancel the noise. I don't listen to music. I just mow and I pray. And it took most of the 2.5 hours to finally hear that my sermon needed to be about living and moving and listening in the silence. So especially as we walk through these next weeks, months, and years, I pray that we can all do the same. Amen. Our closing hymn is hymn number 661.